If an algorithm told you that your soulmate was the last person in the world you would choose, would you trust the technology or your own heart? Welcome to Happiness of Love, your daily dose of K-dramas. Get ready to fall in love with unforgettable stories. Can you tell us where are you listening from? The cell phone screen flickered in Ava Harris's hand as if mocking her. Her heart skipped a beat when the words "perfect match found" appeared in the center of the screen, followed by a name that made her blood run cold. Matt Robinson. No. That couldn't be right. His finger frantically slid across the screen, trying to find some logical explanation. A system error? A prank? But no, there it was, Matt's photo, that annoyingly confident smile, and the text below in bold font, 99% compatibility. Ava let out a dry, incredulous laugh, but felt a knot in her stomach. The air in the office suddenly felt heavier, and the sound of the keyboards around him mixed with the buzz of his own mind trying to process the situation. Then, as if the universe wanted to make everything worse, a familiar voice sounded from behind her. He said he knew she was obsessed with him, but he didn't imagine she would use an app to prove it. Anger shot up her spine before she even turned around. Matt was there, leaning against his desk with his usual expression, an irritating mix of disdain and amusement, as if everything around him existed just to entertain him. Ava closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath and forced a smile before saying that if the application had given that result, it was definitive proof that the technology was still far from perfect. He raised an eyebrow, leaning a little closer to her, as if analyzing her expression. He asked her if she was so sure of that or if she was just afraid to admit that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance the app was right. She laughed, a laugh as sharp as a blade, and countered by saying that she would rather throw herself into the Han River than even consider that possibility. But before Matt could respond, a sound echoed through the office. The screens lit up, showing an institutional video. The company's elegantly dressed CEO smiled for the camera as she heralded the revolution in modern relationships. Soulmate Alert was the world's first app to use advanced artificial intelligence to find your ultimate compatibility, based on thousands of scientific and psychological variables. The team applauded. Excited murmurs spread throughout the floor. But Ava couldn't hear anything other than the sound of her own heart hammering in her chest. The application was the company's big project, and Matt, as head of development, was in charge of all system engineering. She always saw him as a rival at work, someone who never followed rules, who improvised and still achieved brilliant results. He was absolute chaos, and Ava hated chaos. The problem was that, now, chaos was staring at her with a teasing smile, as if it knew something she didn't. And the worst? Everyone was looking at the two. A colleague excitedly whispered that they were the first couple to have a 99% match. Another joked that it was destiny. Someone was already commenting on how this would be great marketing for the company. Ava wanted to disappear. Matt, on the other hand, just smiled, that lazy, secretive smile. Then he said maybe it was time for Ava to accept the facts. After all, it was difficult to argue with such a high number. Ava looked him in the eyes, feeling anger mixed with something she didn't want to name. She was only sure of one thing. If that app was right, then the world really did have a serious programming problem. Ava could still feel Matt's gaze on her, as if he were enjoying her discomfort. The office was buzzing with excited whispers and curious glances, but to her, everything seemed like a blur. Your name, linked to his, printed on the screen, repeated by colleagues as if it were a cosmic joke. I needed to get out of there. I needed air. With firm steps, he crossed the corridor towards the company cafeteria, ignoring the growing heat in his face. The aroma of fresh coffee filled your senses as you pushed open the glass door and entered the cozy space. The noise of the grinding grain and steam from the machine offered momentary relief, a welcome contrast to the confusion in his mind. He picked up his cell phone again, staring at the notification that flashed on the screen. That didn't make sense. It couldn't make sense. She clearly remembered the moment she downloaded the app, one night, sitting on the couch, scrolling distractedly through her cell phone after another exhausting day. She had laughed when she saw the ad. An algorithm capable of finding your soulmate with 99% accuracy? Ridiculous. It was pure marketing, a ploy to attract desperate romantics. But, out of curiosity, or perhaps just to prove that it was nothing more than a cheap trick, he decided to register. He filled out the forms almost automatically, without caring about the details. Preferences, hobbies, behavior patterns, memorable memories. The questionnaire was surprisingly in-depth, but Ava went through it without thinking too much, clicking on options without giving them any real importance. Matt apparently did the same. The idea that he had registered was absurd. He, who always made fun of things like that, who made a point of showing himself to be oblivious to any sentimentality. The scene was almost comical, Matt Robinson, the tech genius, answering questions about his feelings and romantic expectations. A system error. It was the only possible explanation. It was then that she felt his presence once again, before she even saw him. The woody and subtle perfume that always accompanied him mixed with the smell of coffee. She looked up and there he was, leaning casually on the counter, watching her with that smug half-smile. He said it was funny to see her so upset about it, considering she was the one who was always preaching about the perfection of data analysis. Ava closed her eyes for a second, fighting the urge to throw her coffee at him. He responded that what was really funny was seeing someone who developed the intelligence behind the application blindly trusting the results as if they were absolute truths. Matt tilted his head slightly, as if considering his words. She said that, technically, the data doesn't lie, and if the system chose her as his soulmate, then maybe there was a reason for that. She huffed, crossing her arms, irritated by his calmness. He said the only reason was a bug in the programming and that when he found the flaw, he would make sure to rub it in his face. Matt laughed quietly, taking the coffee the barista handed him. There was something provocative in the way he watched her, as if he was enjoying watching her lose control. She said she was eager to see this discovery, but that something told her that the more she investigated, the harder it would be to accept the result. Heat rose to Ava's cheeks, but before she could respond, a cell phone alert interrupted her. Another internal email. The company had just officially announced that the initial tests of the application would be used as a success story in the marketing campaign. More than that, the first compatible couple would be presented at a press conference to reinforce the credibility of the system. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. Matt looked at his cell phone at the same time, and when he looked up at her again, the smile was gone. This time, he also seemed to understand the weight of the situation. They were stuck in this together. And there was no easy way out. Ava clutched her cell phone between her fingers as her mind raced in opposite directions. The email she had just received was a nightmare embodied in polite corporate words, something that, in any other circumstance, she would ignore with an exasperated sigh before deleting. But now, each line pulsed through his vision like a warning of impending catastrophe. The marketing department was excited about the success of the first application compatibility test and, as expected, management wanted to turn this into an advertising strategy. Which meant, in less formal terms, that she and Matt were now the new image of the company, a real, perfect, statistically unquestionable couple. She felt a bitter taste rise in her throat as she imagined the press conference, the curious looks, the journalists insisting to know more about their story. The problem was that there was no story. Just years of rivalry and disagreements that were now about to be repackaged into a storybook romance. Matt broke the silence first, looking at his own cell phone screen with a raised eyebrow. He said the company was taking the joke too far because, honestly, no one in their right mind would look at the two of them and think they were a harmonious couple. Ava let out a dry laugh, shaking her head, responding that, for once in her life, he was finally right. But, before they could even formulate an escape plan, the glass door of the coffee shop opened and Jorge Carter, the head of the marketing department, entered with the vigor of someone who had already had at least 3 cups of coffee that morning. Jorge Carter was always a hurricane of enthusiasm and objectivity, characteristics that made her brilliant at what she did and also slightly frightening. She smiled when she saw them and walked over to the table where they were sitting, pulling out a chair without even asking permission. He said he hoped they had already read the email because they needed to start planning immediately. Her eyes sparkled as if she were facing the biggest opportunity of her career, and Ava felt her stomach drop as she realized that, for Jorge Carter, this was exactly what it was. Matt sat back in his chair, crossing his arms, saying that he loved a good marketing strategy, but turning his personal life into an advertising campaign was a bit beyond what he signed in the contract. Ava immediately agreed, reinforcing that this was a violation of privacy, an absurd extrapolation, and that, even though she worked for the company, she still had the right to decide how her image would be used. Jorge Carter sighed, as if she was already prepared for resistance, and, without losing her composure, said that she perfectly understood their concerns, but that they needed to see the bigger picture. The app was about to be launched and needed credibility, and their case, a perfect match with 99% compatibility in the first testing phase, was definitive proof that the technology worked. They didn't need to actually date, just show the public that they were a legitimate example of the algorithm's effectiveness. Ava felt a wave of frustration rise within her. It all seemed so easy to Jorge Carter, as if asking them to pretend to be a couple was something trivial. She rubbed her temple, trying to collect her thoughts, but it was Matt who broke the silence first. He cocked his head slightly to the side, appraising George Carter with that discerning look, and said that it all sounded interesting, but there was one thing he still didn't understand: what exactly would they gain from this? Jorge Carter smiled, as if he had just been waiting for this question. He said the board was willing to offer generous incentives. Promotions, substantial bonuses, and perks within the company were on the table for both of them. Additionally, positive exposure could open doors in their careers that might have taken years to achieve otherwise. Ava looked at Matt and saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. I knew that expression. It was the look of someone who was seriously considering the proposal. He felt a chill run down his spine, and before he could say anything stupid, he said that it was a terrible idea and that he would never accept something like that. Matt looked back at her and smirked, as if amused by her resistance. He said he understood her concerns, but realistically, fighting the company didn't seem like the best option. If they were being pushed into this situation anyway, why not use it to their advantage? Jorge Carter took advantage of the moment and added that it didn't need to be anything too elaborate. A few public appearances, controlled interviews, perhaps a commercial for the launch of the app, and after that they could return to their normal routines. Besides, pretending to like each other for a few weeks couldn't be that difficult. Ava stared at her in disbelief. How could anyone who knew Matt think that pretending to like him would be an easy task? But before he could protest again, Matt exhaled a dramatic sigh and said that it was okay, he would be part of the campaign, but only if Ava also accepted. Silence fell over the table. George Carter turned his gaze to Ava expectantly, and Matt just waited, still smiling as if he knew exactly what was going through her mind. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, feeling a crushing weight on her back. If he refused, he would likely face reprisals within the company. If she accepted, she would have to spend weeks at Matt's side, enduring his constant sarcasm and the absurd idea that they were a perfect couple. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked directly at Matt, feeling the bitter taste of defeat on his tongue when he said that he accepted, but that if he did anything to make it worse than it already was, the algorithm wouldn't need to predict the future to know that he would end up dead. Matt just laughed, as if this was all the beginning of great fun. The studio was impeccably lit, the lights strategically placed to create a romantic and natural environment. An entire team was moving around, adjusting cameras, microphones and reviewing scripts. At the center of it all, sitting side by side on a sofa carefully decorated with pastel cushions, were Ava Harris and Matt Robinson, ready, or rather, forced, to record the first official video of the promotional campaign. Ava felt the fabric of the blazer stick slightly to her skin, a result of the warm lighting combined with the nervousness she tried to hide at all costs. His posture was rigid, and his fingers, interlaced in his lap, held each other tightly enough that his nails left marks on his palm. Matt, on the other hand, was too relaxed, with one leg crossed over the other and a lazy smile, as if he was enjoying her discomfort. Jorge Carter, who led the session, clapped his hands to get everyone's attention and explained the concept of the video once again. He said they wanted something spontaneous, natural, a conversation between a couple who had met through the app and discovered a genuine connection. He suggested that they talk about their first meeting, about the surprise of discovering how compatible they were and how they were looking forward to this new phase together. The cameraman signaled that they would start recording, and Ava had to suppress a sigh as she heard the countdown. As soon as the camera's red light came on, Matt turned to her with a perfectly rehearsed expression, as if he were truly a man in love. She said she never imagined that an app could predict something like this, but that, after getting to know her better, she realized that everything made sense. Ava felt a wave of irritation course through her body at the ease with which he played the role. She swallowed the urge to roll her eyes and smiled in a controlled manner, saying that at first she was skeptical, but that, as she spent more time with him, she realized that perhaps destiny really existed. Matt tilted his head slightly, evaluating the way she said those words, and then smiled in a way that made an alarm ring in Ava's mind. He said that since they were talking about destiny, they should tell her about that curious detail of their first meeting. Jorge Carter frowned, clearly confused, as the team exchanged interested looks, and Ava had to control her breathing when she realized that Matt was about to take advantage of the situation. He went on to say that on their first date, he was impressed that Ava was so predictable that she ordered the exact same meal as him. Ava felt her face heat up, remembering the day in question and how, without realizing it, she ended up ordering the same dish as Matt just because the menu was too extensive and she didn't want to waste time choosing. He replied that it was not intentional and that, if he had noticed it sooner, he would have changed the order. Matt laughed, enjoying her reaction, and turned to the camera, saying that what he liked most about her was her adorable stubbornness. The camera operator sighed softly, Jorge Carter smiled contentedly and some of the crew exchanged excited glances, as if they were really watching a love story unfold before their eyes. Ava felt her body tense up even more as she realized that, somehow, Matt was managing to turn the situation around and use that campaign to his advantage. The video continued with pre-selected questions, and Ava did her best to stay within the role without losing control. He responded with short sentences, maintained a discreet smile and avoided any interaction that could generate even more material for the marketing team to explore. But Matt, being Matt, did just the opposite, adding little improvised details and stretching out the answers just enough to create the perfect illusion of a real couple. When they finally finished recording, Jorge Carter clapped his hands and said that it had been perfect, that the chemistry between them was undeniable and that the public would certainly buy the idea. Ava let out a discreet sigh and stood up, feeling the muscles in her shoulders still tense. Matt followed her, grabbing a glass of water from one of the nearby tables, and said that, considering the way she was doing, perhaps her career in romance marketing was just beginning. Ava gave him a sharp look and replied that if he ever tried something like that again, he would have to have an algorithm built into the app's programming that would protect him from revenge. Matt just laughed and took a sip of water, clearly enjoying himself more than he should have. The campaign did not end there. There were still promotional events, interviews and, worst of all, a live performance at the app's official launch. Ava knew that this was just beginning, and if she wanted to get out of this with her sanity intact, she would need to find a way to not let Matt control the narrative. The event hall was impeccably decorated, with soft lights reflecting off the huge glass windows and floral arrangements strategically placed along the red carpet. At the center of it all, an elegant stage awaited the most important guests of the night, among them Ava Harris and Matt Robinson, who, against all their wishes, were the faces of the long-awaited launch of Soulmate Alert. Ava felt the fabric of her dress slide against her skin with every step she took, her heels echoing on the shiny floor as camera flashes flashed around her. I was used to corporate events, but I had never been the center of attention in such a personal way. There was something uncomfortably intimate about seeing your own name linked to Matt's in every headline and on the screens that played the promotional campaign on loop. He was at her side, impeccable in a fitted suit, walking with the naturalness of someone who seemed immune to any embarrassment. Ava tried to ignore him, focusing on the rehearsed words for the performance they would give soon, but then she felt the subtle touch of his hand on her back as he guided her closer to the stage. The contact was brief, almost imperceptible, but enough to make her look at him in surprise. He didn't even notice, or, if he did, he didn't show it. The night went on as expected. Enthusiastic speeches about innovation, technical explanations about the algorithm, ambitious projections for the future of the application. But, in the midst of all this, there were also the staged interactions between her and Matt, carefully planned exchanges of glances, calculated smiles, rehearsed answers to questions that the journalists asked with a twinkle in their eyes, as if they were facing a couple about to star in the romance of the year. Ava answered everything automatically, maintaining a professional tone and impeccable posture, but there was something about Matt that was starting to bother her. He wasn't just acting. Not completely. When they asked what else they had learned about each other since the app brought them together, Ava prepared to respond generically, but Matt beat her to the punch. He said that for years he thought he knew Ava, but lately he was discovering that she was much more than the competitive, perfectionist woman he always saw. Ava blinked, momentarily speechless, as he continued to say that there were little details about her that went unnoticed amid their constant bickering, like the fact that whenever she was nervous, she would discreetly touch the end of her own necklace, as if it anchored her to reality. He also said that, behind the seriousness and objectivity, there was someone who genuinely cared about the people around him, but who rarely demonstrated this directly. Ava felt an unexpected tightness in her chest when she heard that. It wasn't the kind of answer he would give just to impress the audience. It was too personal, too precise. She felt the eyes on her and knew she needed to respond, so she took a deep breath and forced a smile before saying that, if there was anything she learned about Matt, it was that, behind that facade of a relaxed and irritatingly self-assured man, there was someone who never accepted losing, not even when it came to small provocations. The audience laughed, the journalists noted every word, and Jorge Carter looked at them with the satisfied expression of someone who knew he had just sold a perfect story. Hours later, when most of the guests had left and the team was dismantling the event structure, Ava found Matt outside, leaning against one of the railings that overlooked the illuminated city. The night wind lightly ruffled her hair, and the distant glow of neon signs reflected in her eyes with an unexpected intensity. He seemed different, quieter, more thoughtful. She approached slowly, still processing his words from earlier. She said she had no idea he paid that much attention to her. Matt didn't look away from the horizon when he replied that it was impossible not to notice certain things when you spent so much time with someone. She crossed her arms, feeling the cold air against the exposed skin of her shoulders, and asked if he had been sincere or if it was part of the show. Matt finally turned to look at her, and for a moment, Ava felt like she was seeing a version of him she'd never met. He said that maybe she had the wrong idea about him, that she always saw him as just a rival and never wondered if there was anything more than that. Ava opened her mouth to respond, but hesitated. The truth was that he never allowed himself to think of Matt in any other way. He was always there, always a constant presence, an opponent, someone she needed to prove herself against. But now, with the entire city around him and the tenuous distance between them, for the first time, he wondered what would happen if he looked at him without that barrier. She felt her heart accelerate, and it irritated her deeply. He replied that, regardless of what he wanted to insinuate, as soon as this campaign ended, everything would return to normal. Matt smirked, that irritating smile full of hidden meanings, and said that maybe she was right. But perhaps I was completely wrong. Ava's cell phone screen glowed with the words that were about to turn her life into absolute chaos. The title of the article was direct, incisive and sharp as a blade, Soulmate Alert, the big technological scam of the year? She blinked once, twice, feeling her stomach drop as the details unfolded before her eyes. The article was not simple speculation or passing criticism. It was a frontal attack, meticulously structured, written with the precision of someone who had carried out a careful investigation. The complaint alleged that the app's revolutionary algorithm was nothing more than a well-disguised hoax, that the results were intentionally manipulated to create convincing stories, regardless of the true compatibility between users. There were graphs, suspicious statistics, anonymous testimonials from former employees claiming that the 99% matches were manufactured to generate engagement and increase the credibility of the product before the official launch. Ava felt a chill run down her spine. If that was true, it meant that her compatibility with Matt was a lie from the beginning. The company cafeteria was crowded, but the sound of conversations around it became just a distant hum. Her coffee cooled untouched on the table as she reread each line of the article, trying to find some inconsistency, something that could invalidate that bombshell before it spread any further. But what he found was a familiar name in the footer of the article. Harry Davis. Ava clutched her cell phone tighter when she recognized the journalist. He was known for his aggressive investigations within the technology industry, having taken down startups and powerful CEOs with his ruthless reporting. If he had decided to attack Soulmate Alert, then the situation was much worse than a simple viral rumor. He heard the sound of a chair being dragged and, before he even looked up, he knew who was there. Matt sat down in front of him unceremoniously, placing his own cell phone on the table with the screen still open to the same story. He said he imagined he would find her there, absorbing every word as if it were a death sentence. Ava looked away from her cell phone and looked directly at him. She felt a lump of frustration grow in her throat and asked if he knew anything. Matt didn't look away, but his expression closed for a brief moment, a moment so quick that anyone else wouldn't have noticed. He said the accusations were ridiculous, that there was no reason to believe the matter was real. Ava crossed her arms, feeling tension building in her shoulders, and asked if he could guarantee that with absolute certainty. Matt held her gaze for a moment longer than he should have, and then looked away at the untouched coffee on the table. He said that the technology was complex and that there was always room for doubt, but that, as far as he knew, there was no manipulation whatsoever. Ava's discomfort only grew. Matt never hesitated when talking about his work. He always responded with confidence, as if he had all the answers before the questions were even asked. But now, there was something different. Something he wasn't saying. She exhaled slowly, trying to organize her thoughts, and asked why the article mentioned testimonials from former employees if everything was as transparent as he wanted to make it seem. Matt licked his lips, an almost imperceptible gesture that Ava recognized as a sign that he was measuring his words before speaking. He said that in any company, there are always disgruntled employees who try to sabotage successful projects. He asked her if she really believed that a technology developed for years could be debunked by a single sensational article. Ava wanted to believe that. I wanted to believe that it was all just a dirty attack by a competitor, that Harry Davis was just trying to generate controversy to gain clicks. But something about the way Matt avoided answering directly made her uneasy. His cell phone vibrated again, and this time the notification was an email from the board calling for an emergency meeting. It was obvious that the entire company was on high alert. Matt stood up first, slipping his cell phone into his pocket and adjusting the watch on his wrist with the irritating calm of someone who seemed unshakable. He said there was no point in panicking now, that the most important thing was to manage the situation before everything got out of control. Ava watched him for a moment before following him, feeling the growing weight of doubt spread throughout her chest. If Matt was hiding something, then the scariest question wasn't whether the app was a scam. It was if he always knew it. The meeting room was filled with tense silence, interrupted only by the sound of constant notifications on the executives' cell phones. Harry Davis's article had spread like wildfire in a dry field, generating explosive headlines, wild speculation and a flood of outraged comments on social media. The Soulmate Alert, once heralded as a revolution in the world of relationships, was now seen as a sophisticated scam, and the pained looks of the directors reflected the growing fear that the company was on the verge of collapse. Ava felt the stiffness in her shoulders as she kept her expression impassive, but inside, her mind was spinning at warp speed. Ever since I read the article, I had been trying to find a rational explanation, something that would prove that this was nothing more than a strategic attack by the competition. But no matter how hard he tried to convince himself, Matt's hesitation echoed in his head like a silent accusation. Jorge Carter was the first to break the silence, his voice firm despite the obvious tension. He said that they needed an immediate statement to contain the damage and that the board expected a technical response from Matt, something that refuted all the allegations with concrete facts. All eyes turned to him, and Ava noticed the exact moment his expression changed, not the usual confident, sarcastic Matt, but someone who, for a split second, looked cornered. Matt ran his hand through his hair, a quick gesture, but one that did not escape Ava's attentive gaze. He said that he understood the gravity of the situation, but that before making any hasty pronouncement, they needed to evaluate the origin of the leaked information. The article mentioned former employees, which indicated that someone within the company could be providing distorted data to Harry. They needed to find out who it was before reacting publicly. The CEO, a man with a hard expression and a calculating look, crossed his fingers on the table and asked directly if the article was a lie. Matt held the gaze, but took half a second too long to respond that the app had been developed based on legitimate research and that any allegations of match fixing were unfounded. Ava felt a shiver run down her spine. He hadn't said it was a lie. Only that the allegations were unfounded. It was a subtle difference, but for someone who knew him so well, that was enough to know something was wrong. The meeting ended with an emergency decision. A press conference would be held within 48 hours, and Matt would be responsible for clarifying doubts about the algorithm and reinforcing the company's credibility. As everyone began to disperse, Ava remained seated, watching Matt as he put away his papers and avoided looking directly at her. He waited until the room was almost empty before finally saying he was lying. Matt paused for a moment, but showed no surprise. He said he didn't know what she was talking about. Ava leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table, feeling the fury building inside her. He said he knew him too well not to realize when he was hiding something. He asked how many parts of the algorithm were real and how many had been changed to produce more attractive results. Matt finally looked up at her, and there was something dark in his expression, something that made Ava's heart race for all the wrong reasons. He sighed, closed his eyes for a second before saying it wasn't that simple. Ava felt her throat go dry. Those 3 words confirmed everything I feared. Matt walked away from the table, shoving his hands in his pockets, looking lost for a moment before finally saying that the algorithm was based on real compatibility, but that, in early tests, the results were not as impressive as the company had hoped. Management pushed for more compelling numbers to impress investors, and small modifications were made to prioritize combinations that were most likely to engage. He said that, technically, there was still a scientific basis behind the process, but that yes, some connections had been adjusted to appear more perfect than they really were. Ava felt the weight of his words like a blow. He asked if that included the 99% among them. Matt hesitated, and then, in a lower tone, said yes. The air seemed to escape Ava's lungs. She felt the bitter taste of humiliation rising in her throat as she realized that the entire absurd situation, from the beginning, had been fabricated. The media, the looks, the campaign that forced her to fake feelings she never had, all based on a lie. But what infuriated her most was the fact that Matt had known this all along and had never said anything. Anger took over before he could stop himself. She said he made her look like a complete idiot, that he let her believe that maybe there was something real there, when in fact it was all just a number manipulated to sell an app. Matt ran his hands over his face, clearly exhausted, and replied that he never wanted things to get out of control like this. Ava laughed, a dry, humorless laugh. He asked what exactly he wanted then. One expected her to simply accept it all as if it didn't matter. Matt pressed his lips together, his gaze finally meeting hers, and there was something broken in his expression when he said that, in the beginning, it didn't matter. But now, maybe it mattered more than he wanted to admit. Ava felt something inside her break. I couldn't tell if it was sadness, anger, or a mix of both. Without saying anything else, she picked up her papers and left the room, ignoring his call. At that moment, I only knew one thing. If Matt thought everything could be fixed, he was about to discover that some things just can't be fixed. Rain lashed the company's glass windows, running in uneven trails that reflected the office's cold lights. The muffled sound of the drops against the concrete matched perfectly the storm inside Ava, as she crossed the hallway with firm steps, feeling her heart hammering against her ribs. He still felt Matt's voice echoing in his mind, that bitter confession that reduced everything they had experienced in the last few weeks to a big lie. He knew. All along, he knew. Her fingers clenched tightly on her phone, the notification from Harry Davis' article still flashing on the screen, as if mocking her naivety. With each new update, the application's reputation plummeted, and now, with new discoveries about data manipulation, the media was preparing to destroy the company once and for all. But to Ava, none of that mattered more than the fact that Matt, the person who spent years irritating her with his insufferable sarcasm and arrogance, had somehow managed to break the only thing she had ever offered him, her trust. She pushed open the door to his office without knocking, feeling her chest swell with accumulated anger. Matt sat at the table, the soft light from the lamp casting angular shadows on his tired face. His gaze slowly rose to meet hers, but he didn't seem surprised. He said he knew she would come. Ava ignored the measured calm in his voice and threw her cell phone on the table, the screen glowing with headlines about the fraud. She asked how he had the courage to let her believe the lie, how he could watch as she was turned into a marketing piece for something that was never real. Matt held her gaze, his jaw clenching for a moment before saying he never wanted it to be like this. Her anger only grew. She then asked him how he wanted it to be, if he hoped that one day she would simply forget that her entire life was used as an experiment. Matt sighed and ran a hand through his hair, clearly exhausted, but Ava didn't care about his exhaustion. He said that for someone who always prided himself on being a technology genius, he did a terrible job of predicting that this would end up destroying everything. Matt finally stood up, pushing his chair back, and crossed the distance between them. He said he knew she was angry, but it wasn't that simple. The company needed numbers, investors demanded proof that the technology worked, and he tried to hold the situation for as long as possible without compromising the app's concept. Ava laughed, a dry, incredulous laugh. He asked if holding back the situation meant manipulating the matches to create perfect couples, if he really thought no one would notice. Matt looked down for a brief moment before replying that, at the time, it seemed like the only choice. Ava felt a bitter taste in her mouth as she realized there was no real regret in his voice, just cold resignation. He said the only real choice he made was to deceive her. Matt looked at her again, and there was something tense in his gaze when he asked if that was what she really thought. Silence stretched between them, heavy as the air before a storm. Ava clenched her fists, feeling her fury mix with something she didn't want to admit, disappointment. She asked him if he even considered telling her the truth before everything exploded, if he ever thought she deserved to know. Matt exhaled slowly before saying that he thought about it, but every day it became more difficult. Ava laughed again, shaking her head in disbelief at the way he said it like it was some kind of moral dilemma. He asked if he thought hiding the truth was some kind of favor. Matt looked away from the window, watching the rain outside, and his voice came lower as he said that, at first, it was just a strategic decision, but then, something changed. Ava frowned, feeling a sudden discomfort in the way he chose his words. Matt licked his lips, hesitated for a second before finally saying that at some point he stopped thinking of it as just a variable in the code and started seeing it as something that could never have been predicted by the algorithm. He said if he could do it all over again, he would have liked to have told me before things got out of hand. Ava felt a wave of confusion course through her chest. I didn't want to hear that now. I didn't want him to make everything even more complicated than it already was. He said it was too late for anything. Matt took a step closer, and Ava hated the fact that her body realized the proximity before her mind did. He said that if she wanted to hate him, that was fine, but that no matter what happened, something between them was real. Ava felt the air escape her lungs and hated it even more. The only real thing there was the fact that she no longer trusted him. He took his cell phone from the table and turned his back, leaving the office without looking back. The sky over Seoul was covered in dense clouds, and the air carried a biting cold, as if it reflected exactly the state of Ava Harris's mind. I walked aimlessly through the busy streets, watching the diffuse lights of neon signs flicker on the damp asphalt. The hum of cars mixed with the buzz of conversations around, but nothing could break the confusion that was pounding in his head. Ever since she left Matt's office, she felt like she was stuck in a limbo between anger and something she refused to name. He had lied, betrayed her trust, and made a fool of her in front of the entire country, and yet, part of her couldn't just dismiss him as a wrong equation to be corrected. His cell phone vibrated insistently inside his coat pocket. Messages from colleagues, urgent emails from management, attempts at damage control. But it was only when an unexpected name appeared on the screen that his steps faltered for a second. Harry Davis. The journalist who had started all the chaos. Ava hesitated before answering, feeling a shiver run down her spine when she heard his voice on the other end. He said he knew she probably hated him, but he thought she deserved to know something before making any decisions. There was a detail in the story that no one had mentioned, a factor that might make her reconsider what she thought she knew about Matt. The meeting took place in a discreet cafe, far from the frenetic movement of the districts most targeted by the press. Harry arrived on time, with the same calculating expression and sharp gaze that made him a feared journalist in the industry. He placed his cell phone on the table, a subtle gesture that indicated that the conversation was not being recorded. He said that when he investigated the manipulation of the algorithm, he discovered something that was not in the leaked reports. Matt's name appeared consistently in technical decisions, but the pattern showed that, in most cases, he tried to limit changes imposed by company executives. Ava frowned, unable to hide her surprise. He asked what he meant by that. Harry leaned forward slightly, fingers tapping against his coffee cup as he explained that Matt was against match fixing from the start, that he fought internally to maintain the integrity of the algorithm but was forced to make concessions to keep his position and prevent the project from being completely disfigured. He said there were records of meetings where Matt warned that falsifying matches could destroy the app's credibility, but that directors were more concerned about immediate numbers than long-term reputation. Ava felt an uncomfortable pang in her chest. Part of her wanted to doubt it, but the pieces began to fall into place in unsettling ways. She thought about Matt's hesitant manner the last few days, the way he avoided directly answering her questions. He knew things were wrong, but somehow he seemed to have tried to contain the damage. The question that now hung over her was why. Harry watched his expression and let out a soft sigh before saying that for someone so intelligent, Matt had made a colossal mistake. He could have protected himself, he could have let the blame fall entirely on the board, but he didn't. Instead, he took responsibility and let everyone believe he was the only one to blame. He said he didn't know why, but for someone so ambitious, it seemed less like a failure and more like a choice. Ava left the cafe feeling the weight of a truth she didn't expect to encounter. Matt wasn't innocent, but he wasn't the villain of the story either. And the most annoying thing of all was realizing that, even though I knew this, I still couldn't forgive him completely. When she finally decided she needed to confront him, she found her office empty. The assistant informed, without details, that he had requested temporary leave from the company. Ava felt a strange emptiness when she heard this, as if something was out of place. Without thinking much, he took a taxi to the address Matt had put on the company's contact form years ago, not sure what he would say when he met him. The small residential building was discreet, and the light rain that was beginning to fall made the night even more melancholic. He climbed the narrow stairs, feeling the cold seep under his coat, and stopped in front of the door hesitantly. When he finally knocked, he heard slow footsteps and then the door opened, revealing Matt with a surprised expression, tiredness evident on his face. He didn't say anything for a moment, just watched her as if he didn't know whether to feel relieved or worried about her presence there. Ava took a deep breath before finally asking him why he didn't tell her the truth from the beginning. Matt rested one hand against the door frame and looked away at the rain falling behind her before saying that at first he tried to fight the changes, but realized that if he pushed too hard he would completely lose any control over the project. He said he made bad choices, that he compromised his own integrity to try to minimize the damage, but that, in the end, he realized that he only made everything worse. Ava tightened her arms around herself, feeling the dampness of the rain in her hair and wondering why, even now, she was still there, listening. He asked why he didn't defend himself when the article came out, why he let the world believe he was solely responsible. Matt finally looked back at her, and there was something vulnerable in his expression when he said that, deep down, perhaps he had always expected someone like her to confront him before he himself had the courage to face what he had done. Ava felt the air escape her lungs, not knowing if what she felt was frustration or something deeper, something she wasn't ready to name. Matt sighed and said he knew he didn't deserve anything from her, but for once he wanted to fight for something that wasn't just a code or a compatibility number. Ava watched his face for a long moment, feeling all the doubts and hurt still weighing on her, but also something unexpected, the certainty that Matt, for once, was being completely sincere. The rain had eased, turning into a fine drizzle that glistened under the street lamps, reflecting little shards of golden light on the dark asphalt. The smell of wet earth mixed with the cold breeze that blew between the buildings, and Ava remained there, motionless, feeling every detail of that moment. Matt was still standing in the doorway, his silhouette silhouetted by the soft light of the apartment, his gaze fixed on her as if he was waiting for her to say something that could undo the weight of the past between them. But the words didn't come easily. Maybe because, for the first time, Ava didn't know exactly what she felt. He had lied. He had used it as part of a strategy to save a project that could not be saved. But at the same time, he had also tried to protect her, even if in a clumsy and imperfect way. He had chosen to bear the blame alone, allowed everyone to see him as the only one to blame. And now, after everything, here he was, with no excuse prepared, no attempt to convince her to stay. Just waiting, as if he knew the decision was no longer in his hands. Ava took a deep breath, feeling the cold reach her skin through the thin fabric of her coat. He thought about everything they had been through together, from the first confrontations to the most subtle moments, those that were not in the marketing campaigns, but that had infiltrated her without her realizing it. The way Matt always seemed to know exactly what to say to get under her skin. The way he paid attention to the little details about her, even when he pretended he didn't care. The way, even now, in the midst of all this chaos, he was still there. She said she didn't know if she could forgive him. Matt nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer, but then said he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He said he knew what he did was wrong, that there was no justification, but that if there was any possibility of starting over, he wanted it to be real this time. No algorithms, no statistics, no compatibility predictions. Just them, discovering on their own what they meant to each other. Ava held her breath, feeling her chest tighten in a way she hated to admit. I wanted to hate him more, I wanted to tell him that it was too late, that nothing he said would change what happened. But when she looked into his eyes, she realized there was something different there. He wasn't the Matt he used to be, always so sure of himself, always with a ready answer for everything. This was someone who was finally willing to risk something he couldn't control. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. The world around them continued its course, the cars passing in the distance, the streetlights flickering in the light rain, the city continuing indifferent to what was happening between them. Then Ava took a step back, feeling the cold intensify as she walked away from the door. He said he still didn't know what the answer to all of this would be. Matt nodded, without insisting, without asking for anything more. I just said that, for once, I was willing to wait. Ava turned, walking slowly down the steps, feeling the weight of the moment in each step. When she reached the sidewalk, she looked back one last time and found Matt still there, standing in the doorway, watching her as if he was memorizing that moment. And then, she walked away, letting the light rain follow her through the city streets, without looking back. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time, she didn't need an app to tell her what her next step was. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe to Happiness of Love. That way, you won't miss any of our heartfelt romances. See you in the next love story.